Sometimes the ocean gives back what it has taken, but never without a price. The lighthouse beam swept across Serpent's rock like a ghostly finger, illuminating the jagged Maine coastline where Dr. Samuel Hartwell had spent the last 3 months in self-imposed exile. The October storm hammered the research station with biblical fury, but Sam barely noticed. He'd grown numb to everything except the guilt that gnawed at his chest like a living thing. 5 years ago, he'd failed to save his own son from drowning. Now, as one of the country's leading marine biologists, he dedicated his life to understanding the very waters that had claimed Lucas. It was penance disguised as science, and everyone knew it. When the lightning flash revealed something struggling in the tide pools below, Sam's training kicked in before his trauma could stop him. The creature appeared to be a wolf pup, impossibly far from any mainland pack, drowning in the churning foam. But the moment his hands pulled it from the icy water, Sam stared into eyes that looked disturbingly human, intelligent, grateful, and somehow familiar. What happened next would shatter everything Sam thought he knew about grief, reality, and the thin line between salvation and damnation. But here's what haunts me about this story. Can a man truly save something that was never meant to be saved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hook. The creature in Sam's arms was impossibly warm for something that had been drowning moments ago. Its fur, if it could be called fur, seemed to shimmer between textures, sometimes coarse like a wolf's winter coat, sometimes soft as a child's hair. The pup couldn't weigh more than 20 pounds, but Sam felt the strange sensation that he was holding something much heavier, as if grief itself had taken physical form. "Easy now," he whispered, the words torn away by the howling wind. Lightning split the sky again, and in that stark white moment, Sam glimpsed the creature's face more clearly. The snout was elongated like a wolf's, but the bone structure underneath seemed wrong, too human, too knowing. The eyes that met his were amber gold, and held an intelligence that made the hair on his neck stand on end. The research station's weatherproofing had been tested by dozens of storms, but tonight the wind found every weakness. Windows rattled in their frames as Sam carried the pup inside, leaving a trail of seawater across the polished concrete floor. The station felt more like a bunker than a laboratory, all reinforced glass and steel beams designed to withstand nature's fury. Charts of ocean currents and thermal patterns covered every wall, a lifetime of marine research that had become Sam's fortress against memory. He set the creature down on a towel near the industrial heater, expecting it to cower or flee. Instead, it sat with perfect stillness, watching him with those unsettling eyes. Sam had rescued dozens of marine animals over his career, seals, dolphins, even a few whales, but none had ever looked at him like this, like they knew him. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" Sam said, more to fill the silence than because he expected an answer. The lighthouse beam continued its endless rotation outside, casting moving shadows that made the pup's features seem to shift and change. The rational part of his mind catalogued what he was seeing. Cranial structure inconsistent with any known wolf subspecies, fall-limb proportions that suggested partial bipedal capability, and those eyes. Christ, those eyes that seemed to reflect not light but understanding. 3 months of isolation on Serpent's Rock had provided plenty of time for reading local folklore, and the old fishermen's tales spoke of creatures that swam between worlds when storms raged hard enough. But Sam was a scientist. He dealt in facts, data, measurable phenomena. He'd spent 5 years studying ocean conditions and survival rates, because numbers didn't lie, didn't break promises, didn't slip beneath the surface, while their father argued with maritime rescue about response times. The pup made a sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a word. Sam found himself kneeling beside it, professional curiosity warring with something deeper and more dangerous. Hope, maybe, or the kind of desperation that made smart men do stupid things. "Let's get you checked out," he said, reaching for his examination kit. But when his fingers brushed against the creature's fur again, The world tilted sideways. For just a moment, he could swear he heard something impossible, a child's laughter carried on the wind, high and sweet and achingly familiar. Sam jerked his hand back, heart hammering. The station felt suddenly too small, too quiet despite the storm raging outside. He'd chosen Serpent's Rock precisely because it was isolated, 47 miles from the nearest inhabited land. The lighthouse was automated, the research station fully self-sufficient. No visitors, no distractions, no well-meaning colleagues asking how he was holding up. Just him and his guilt, and an ocean that had taken everything that mattered. The pup tilted its head, studying him with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. Sam had read about psychological projection, about how trauma could make people see meaning in random events. Isolated researchers sometimes anthropomorphized their subjects, attributed human emotions to animals incapable of such complexity. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the foundation of the rock itself. In the aftermath, Sam could hear something new, a sound like singing, faint and wordless, coming from somewhere beyond the storm. The pup's ears perked up, and it moved toward the window with fluid grace that looked wrong on such a young creature. Sam followed, pressing his face against the reinforced glass. The lighthouse beam swept across the churning waters, illuminating whitecaps that rose and fell like breathing. For a moment, he thought he saw other shapes moving in the depths, larger forms that might have been driftwood or debris, or they might have been something else entirely. The pup made that almost sound again, and this time Sam was certain. It wasn't quite human speech, but it was trying to be. The creature was learning, adapting, becoming something new with each passing moment. And those amber gold eyes never left his face, as if waiting for him to understand something crucial, something that would change everything. The storm howled its approval, and Serpent's Rock settled deeper into its ancient secrets. Sam forced himself to step back from the window, breaking the spell of those impossible amber eyes. The rational part of his mind, the part that had earned a PhD from Woods Hole, that had published 43 peer-reviewed papers on marine ecosystems, demanded he treat this like any other rescue. Document, examine, categorize. Right, he said aloud, his voice steadier than he felt. Let's do this properly. He moved to the supply cabinet, with the methodical precision that had defined his career for over 2 decades. Digital camera, specimen containers, measuring tape, basic veterinary supplies. The routine of scientific observation had always been his anchor, a way to impose order on the chaos of the natural world. It had gotten him through the early days after Sarah left, through the endless nights when sleep brought only dreams of dark water and a voice calling for Daddy. The pup watched his preparations with that unsettling intelligence, occasionally tilting its head as if following his thought process rather than just his movements. When Sam approached with the camera, it didn't flinch or flee. Instead, it seemed to pose, lifting its chin slightly and fixing those golden eyes directly on the lens. Unusual socialization patterns for a juvenile, Sam murmured, falling back into the clinical language that had always been easier than emotion. He snapped several photos, the flash illuminating features that looked increasingly wrong in the stark light. The bone structure around the eyes was too human, the way the creature held itself too deliberate. His phone, one of the few pieces of technology that worked reliably this far from shore, buzzed with an incoming message. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and Sam's stomach clenched. Their communication had dwindled to perfunctory exchanges about bills and legal documents, but she still texted occasionally, usually when she'd been drinking. Lighthouse duty again. Running away won't bring him back, Sam. He set the phone aside without responding. Sarah had remarried last spring. A kind man named David who worked in insurance and probably never woke up screaming about riptides. She'd moved on, built something new from the ashes of their shared tragedy. Sam envied her that resilience, even as he resented it. The pup made that almost vocal sound again, drawing his attention back. When he looked down, it had moved closer, close enough that he could feel warmth radiating from its strange fur. Its head was tilted in what looked like concern, and for a moment, Sam felt seen in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "You're a good listener," he said softly. "Better than most people." His laptop chimed with an incoming video call. Dr. Elena Vasquez, his research partner and one of the few colleagues who still checked on him regularly. Her face appeared on the screen, dark hair pulled back in its usual practical ponytail, background showing her cluttered office at the Marine Research Institute. "Sam, thank God," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I've been watching the storm tracking. Are you all right out there? The Weather Service is calling it a once-in-a-decade event." "I'm fine, Elena. The station's holding up well." He angled the laptop so the pup wouldn't be visible in the frame, an instinctive decision that surprised him. Just riding it out. "You know, there's still time to come back for the Henderson Symposium next week. Your research on thermal layer disruption would be perfect for the keynote panel." Elena's expression grew gentle. "It's been 5 years. Sam Lucas wouldn't want you to exile yourself like this." The name hit him like a physical blow, the way it always did when someone else said it. Elena meant well, they all did, but none of them understood that exile wasn't punishment, it was preservation. Out here, 47 miles from shore, he couldn't fail anyone else, couldn't let his guard down at the wrong moment, couldn't trust the ocean to be anything other than the hungry, patient predator it was. "I'm needed here," he said. "The October current patterns are showing unusual variations. Could be significant for the migration studies." Elena's eyes softened with the particular kind of sadness reserved for old friends watching someone destroy themselves slowly. "Sam, I should go," he said quickly. "Storm's getting worse. I need to secure the equipment." He ended the call before she could argue, then sat in the sudden silence, feeling the familiar weight of isolation settle around him like a familiar coat. The pup moved closer still, until it was pressed against his leg. The warmth was startling, almost feverish, and when Sam looked down, those amber eyes seemed to hold an impossible depth of understanding. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Serpent's rock, waves crashing against stone that had weathered centuries of such fury. The lighthouse beam swept its eternal circle, a rhythm that usually comforted him but tonight felt ominous, like a countdown to something he couldn't name. The pup's breathing had synchronized with his own, and in the spaces between thunderclaps, Sam could swear he heard that distant singing again, wordless and haunting and achingly familiar, like a lullaby half-remembered from dreams. The singing grew stronger as the storm reached its crescendo, and Sam found himself moving toward the sound without conscious decision. The pup padded alongside him, its claws clicking against the concrete floor in a rhythm that somehow matched the distant melody. When they reached the observation window facing north, Sam pressed his palm against the reinforced glass and felt it vibrate with each thunderclap. That's when he saw them. Dark shapes moved beneath the churning surface, too large and purposeful to be debris. They swam in formation, cutting through the violent water with impossible grace. Sam grabbed his binoculars with trembling hands, adjusting the focus as lightning illuminated the scene in stark detail. They were humanoid but wrong, elongated limbs that ended in webbed appendages, torsos that seemed to flow between human and something else entirely. Their heads broke the surface occasionally, revealing features that made Sam's scientific mind recoil. Faces that were almost human, almost wolf, almost something that had never been meant to exist in the natural world. And they were all looking directly at the lighthouse. "Jesus Christ," Sam whispered, the binoculars slipping from his suddenly nerveless fingers. The rational explanations his mind frantically offered. Mass hallucination brought on by isolation. Stress-induced psychosis. Simple misidentification of marine mammals. Crumbled as one of the creatures raised what might have been an arm in acknowledgement. They knew he was watching. The pup at his feet made that almost vocal sound again, and this time Sam clearly heard the shape of a word forming "da." Sam spun around, staring down at the creature. Its mouth was opening and closing with deliberate effort, amber eyes fixed on his face with desperate intensity. The bone structure around its muzzle seemed to be shifting, becoming more human with each attempted syllable. Da. Dee. No. Sam backed away from the pup, his heart hammering against his ribs. No, that's not possible. You're an animal. Animals don't. Daddy. The word came out perfectly formed, spoken in a voice that turned Sam's blood to ice water. It was Lucas's voice. Not similar to it, not reminiscent of it. It was exactly the voice of his 7-year-old son, down to the slight lisp on the D that the speech therapist had been working to correct before the accident. The pup, the thing, stood on its hind legs with fluid grace, front paws extending toward him in a gesture he recognized with sick certainty. It was how Lucas used to ask to be picked up, arms outstretched with complete trust that Daddy would always be there to catch him. Daddy, I've been looking for you everywhere. Sam's back hit the wall, his scientific worldview cracking apart like ice in a spring thaw. The creature took a step closer, and Sam could see its features continuing to shift and blur. The wolf-like snout was retracting, the skull reshaping itself into something achingly familiar. The amber eyes darkened to brown, Lucas's brown inherited from his mother. You left me in the water, Daddy. It was so cold, and I called for you, but you didn't come fast enough. You're not real, Sam said, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. Lucas is dead. I watched them pull his body from the water. I identified him at the morgue. I buried my son. The transformation was accelerating now, fur receding to reveal pale skin, limbs adjusting to human proportions. The creature that had been a wolf pup moments ago was becoming a perfect replica of Lucas at age 7. Gap-toothed smile, cowlick that never laid flat. The small scar above his left eyebrow from falling off his bicycle. I'm not dead, Daddy. I've been waiting. The others brought me back so I could find you. The thing wearing his son's face took another step closer. They told me you blame yourself, but it wasn't your fault. The ocean just wanted to play a game. Behind the creature, the observation window exploded inward as something massive struck it from outside. Glass shattered across the floor in a shower of crystalline fragments, and seawater poured through the opening, along with the howling wind. Dark shapes writhed in the breach, the other creatures from the depths, pulling themselves into his sanctuary with movements that defied anatomy. Sam faced an impossible choice. Everything he believed about reality, about death, about the immutable laws of nature was crumbling around him. Either he was suffering a complete psychotic break, in which case he was alone on a remote island during a hurricane, hallucinating threats that didn't exist, or the creature wearing his dead son's face was real, brought back by things that swam in spaces between worlds. The logical choice was to reject what his eyes were showing him, to trust in science and reason. But the father in him, the part that had never stopped hoping for a miracle, whispered treacherous possibilities. Daddy. The Lucas thing extended its hand toward him as chaos erupted around them. Come home with me. We can be together again just like before. Sam stared at that small hand, so perfectly like his son's it made his chest ache, and realized he was about to make the most important decision of his life. Time seemed to crystallize around that extended hand. Sam's entire world had condensed to this single moment, the choice between madness and impossible hope, between scientific rationality and a father's desperate love. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as seawater pooled around his feet and the storm raged through the shattered window. I can't, he whispered, pulling his hands against his chest, as if to protect himself from the temptation. You're not Lucas. Lucas is gone. But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at him like acid. The creature's voice, its mannerisms, the way it tilted its head when confused, every detail was perfect. How could his mind fabricate something so complete, so achingly real? Sam had spent 5 years trying to forget the precise sound of his son's laughter, the exact shade of brown in those trusting eyes, and here it all was, standing before him with water dripping from hair that cowlicked in exactly the right direction. The others told me you'd be scared, the Lucas thing said, lowering its hand but not retreating. They said grief makes people forget how to hope. But I knew you'd remember me, Daddy. You always said you'd never forget. Behind the creature, more of those impossible beings pulled themselves through the broken window. They moved with predatory patience, arranging themselves in a semicircle but coming no closer, waiting, watching. Their features shifted constantly in the strobing lighthouse beam, sometimes more human, sometimes more beast, as if they couldn't quite decide what they wanted to be. Sam's scientific training screamed at him to run, to reject what couldn't be real. Shape-shifting entities didn't exist outside of folklore and fantasy novels. Dead children didn't return from the ocean wearing familiar faces. The rational explanation was clear: prolonged isolation, guilt-induced psychosis, possibly a complete nervous breakdown. He should be calling for emergency evacuation, not standing here engaging with hallucinations. But what if he was wrong? The question that had tormented him for 5 years rose again with vicious clarity. What if Lucas had survived those first crucial minutes underwater? What if Sam had searched just a little longer, dove a little deeper, moved a little faster? The Coast Guard had called off the rescue after 6 hours, declared it a recovery operation. Sam had accepted their judgment because he was a scientist, because he understood hypothermia and drowning protocols and the statistical impossibility of survival. What if statistics had lied? "I dream about that day," Sam said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Every night, I dream about reaching the beach 2 minutes sooner, about seeing you fall in, about being the father you deserved, instead of the one who failed you." The Lucas thing's expression crumpled with perfect 7-year-old grief. "You didn't fail me, Daddy. The water spirits just wanted me to go with them for a while. But I told them I couldn't stay forever because my daddy needed me." Sam closed his eyes, but the image remained burned into his retinas. Lucas in his red swimming trunks, the ones with the shark pattern he'd loved so much. The same trunks they'd buried him in because Sarah said he'd want to wear his favorites. "You're not him," Sam said, opening his eyes with tremendous effort. "You're something else wearing his face. Something that feeds on grief and guilt and desperation." The creature's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those brown eyes, a flash of something ancient and hungry that confirmed Sam's worst fears. Yet even knowing what it was, even recognizing the predatory intelligence beneath the familiar features, he found himself taking a step forward. "Does it matter?" the thing asked, and its voice carried undertones now, harmonics that no human throat could produce. "If I can be him for you, if I can give you back what the ocean took, does it matter what I really am?" That was the question that paralyzed him. Sam understood the psychology of grief, had read extensively about magical thinking and the mind's desperate attempts to deny unbearable loss. He knew he was being manipulated by something that had studied him, learned his weaknesses, crafted the perfect lure. But the father in him, the part that still bought birthday presents every March 15th and left them unwrapped in Lucas's unchanged bedroom, whispered treacherous possibilities. Maybe this was justice. Maybe the universe owed him this chance to get it right. Maybe love was stronger than death, stronger than the physical laws that governed his rational world. The creatures from the ocean pressed closer, their forms becoming more solid, more threatening. The choice was slipping away from him, moment by moment. Soon it would be too late to choose at all. "Come with us, Daddy," the Lucas thing urged, extending its hand again. "Come home where you belong, where we can be a family again." Sam stared at that perfect, impossible hand and felt his carefully constructed defenses crumbling. 5 years of guilt and grief and desperate longing crashed over him like a riptide, threatening to drag him under. He reached toward his dead son, trembling with doubt and terrible hope. Sam's fingers brushed against the creature's palm, and the contact sent a jolt of electric recognition through his entire body. The skin was warm, soft, exactly as he remembered from countless bedtime stories and scraped knee comfortings. For one perfect, impossible moment, it was Lucas's hand in his, small and trusting and alive. Then the lighthouse beam swept across them again, and Sam saw the truth written in the shadows between the creature's fingers. The hand was real, but beneath the familiar flesh, something else moved, darker shapes that writhed like living water, like the spaces between waves where light never reached. The thing wearing his son's face smiled with Lucas's gap-toothed grin, but the expression went too wide, revealing teeth that were just slightly too sharp. "That's it, Daddy," it whispered. And now Sam could hear the ocean in its voice, the sound of waves pulling back from shore, of depths that had no bottom. "Don't fight it anymore. You've been fighting for so long." And Sam realized with crystalline clarity that he had been fighting. Every day for 5 years, he'd battled against the truth of what he'd lost, what he'd failed to save. The isolation, the exile to remote research stations, the careful distance from anything that might remind him of Lucas. It had all been a war against his own grief, a desperate attempt to build walls high enough to keep the pain from drowning him. The other creatures pressed closer, their forms solidifying in the strobing light. Sam could see them clearly now, beings that moved between human and beast, between flesh and water, between the world he knew and places that existed in the spaces between heartbeats. They watched with ancient eyes that held depths older than the ocean itself, patient as tides wearing down stone. "We've been waiting," the Lucas thing continued, its grip tightening on Sam's hand. "Waiting for you to stop running. Waiting for you to come where the water can't hurt you anymore, where you'll never have to watch helplessly again." The seawater, spreading across the lighthouse floor, began to glow with phosphorescent light, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometries that suggested doorways leading somewhere else entirely. Sam felt the pull of it, the promise of surrender. No more guilt, no more nights waking up to phantom sounds of a child calling for help. No more birthdays marked by silence and unwrapped gifts, just the sweet relief of letting go. "Yes," Sam whispered, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff. "Yes, I'll come." The moment he spoke the acceptance aloud, everything changed. The lighthouse walls seemed to dissolve around them, replaced by a vast underwater cathedral lit by that same strange phosphorescence. Sam found himself breathing liquid light instead of air, suspended in a space that existed between the physical world and somewhere far older. The creatures surrounded him now, their true forms revealed, beautiful and terrible beings that had swum in Earth's oceans before humans drew their first breath. The Lucas thing began to change again, its features flowing like water. But this time Sam wasn't afraid. He understood now that this wasn't deception, it was transformation. The entity before him had indeed found his son in those final moments beneath the waves, had preserved something essential of Lucas in its alien consciousness. Not resurrection, but translation. Not the return of the dead, but the continuation of love in forms that transcended mortal understanding. "Do you see?" the being asked, and its voice was Lucas's voice layered with harmonics of eternity. "Death isn't an ending, Daddy. It's just deeper water." Sam nodded, tears streaming down his face as he finally stopped fighting. The guilt that had been his constant companion for 5 years began to dissolve, replaced by something he'd thought he'd lost forever: peace. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of understanding. Lucas hadn't died afraid and alone. He'd been found, preserved, translated into something that could exist in the spaces between worlds. "Take me to him," Sam said, his voice steady now with the certainty of absolute surrender. "Take me where I should have gone 5 years ago." The beings moved forward as one, their forms shifting between solid and liquid, between real and impossible. Sam felt them lift him, carry him toward the glowing geometric patterns that served as doorways to their realm. The last vestiges of his scientific skepticism fell away like shed skin as he crossed the threshold between what he'd always believed possible and what love could make real. Behind them, Serpent's rock lighthouse continued its eternal watch over empty waters, its beams sweeping across waves that had already forgotten the man who'd spent 5 years learning that some depths couldn't be measured, some currents couldn't be fought, and some journeys required abandoning everything you thought you knew about the difference between salvation and drowning. Sam Hartwell was finally going home. The passage between worlds felt like drowning in reverse. Instead of water filling his lungs, Sam felt himself becoming the water, his consciousness dispersing into countless droplets of awareness that somehow remained coherently him. The geometric doorways collapsed behind them, with sounds like distant thunder, sealing off the lighthouse and everything he'd once called reality. When the sensation stopped, Sam found himself standing on what appeared to be a vast coral reef, though the structures around him defied any marine biology he'd ever studied. Towering spires twisted upward into darkness, their surfaces pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to respond to his heartbeat. The water here was breathable but heavy, carrying whispers of voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. "Welcome to the deep courts," the Lucas entity said, its form stabilizing into something that was mostly his son but touched with otherworldly grace. "This is where the ocean keeps its promises." Sam looked around in wonder and growing unease. Other figures moved through the phosphorescent gloom, beings like those that had come for him, but older, more established in their impossible anatomies. Some retained enough humanity to be recognizable as people who had once walked on dry land. Others had surrendered their original forms entirely, becoming living embodiments of currents and tides. "Are they all?" Sam began. Grief brought, finished a voice behind him. Sam turned to see a woman approaching, her features shifting between human and something that might have been a seal in its primal form. Those who loved so deeply that they followed their lost ones into the depths. "I am Narida. I was like you once, a mother who couldn't let go." Sam felt a chill that had nothing to do with the water temperature. "How long have you been here?" Time moves differently in the deep courts. A day, a decade, a century. They blur together like waves. Nerida's smile was kind but carried an edge of madness that made Sam's scientific instincts scream warnings. "The important thing is that I found my daughter. We're together now, forever. Isn't that what matters?" Before Sam could respond, the water around them began to churn with new arrivals. More of the ocean beings emerged from the darkness, but these moved with predatory purpose that set Sam's nerves on edge. The Lucas entity stepped protectively closer to him. "The Tide Lords," it whispered. "They're not happy about your arrival. Some of them think humans bring too much chaos to the deep courts." The largest of the newcomers glided forward, its form a nightmare fusion of shark and something vaguely humanoid. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of crushing depths and ships' hulls cracking under pressure. "Another surface dweller seeks to cheat the natural order," it rumbled. "The ocean gives up its dead only when it chooses. You have no claim here, grief-bringer." Sam felt his newfound peace wavering as the political realities of this underwater realm became apparent. He wasn't just a grieving father being reunited with his son, he was an outsider whose presence threatened some delicate balance he didn't understand. "I have every right," Sam said, surprising himself with his firmness. "Lucas is my son. Love doesn't recognize your territorial boundaries." The Tide Lord's laugh was the sound of tsunamis being born. "Love? You understand nothing of love, surface dweller. Love is what feeds us, what gives us strength. Your grief, your desperate need, its sustenance. The child shape beside you is bait, and you've bitten deep." The words hit Sam like a physical blow. Around him, he could see the truth in the subtle changes in posture of the other grief-brought humans. They weren't families reunited. They were livestock, kept docile and content while their emotional energy was harvested by beings that had learned to wear the faces of the dead. But the Lucas entity squeezed his hand, and when Sam looked down, he saw genuine distress in those familiar brown eyes. "Don't listen to them, Daddy. They're just jealous because our love is stronger than their hunger. I am Lucas. Not all of him, but the part that matters. The part that will always need you." Sam found himself caught between two impossible truths. Either this was an elaborate feeding system designed to trap the grieving, or love really could transcend death in ways that science had never imagined. The Tide Lords circled closer, their alien features twisted with anticipation, while Nerida and the other grief watched with expressions of desperate hope. as if Sam's choice might somehow validate their own. "Choose quickly, surface dweller," the Tide Lord hissed. "Accept your place as cattle in our fields, or face the tests that will determine whether your love is truly strong enough to claim residence in the deep courts. But know this, the tests break most who attempt them. The ocean floor is littered with the bones of those who thought their grief gave them rights in our domain." Sam looked at the creature wearing his son's face, at the gathered beings whose motives he couldn't fathom, at the alien beauty of a realm that might be salvation or the most elaborate trap ever devised. The choice before him was no longer simple surrender. It was a gamble with stakes he was only beginning to understand. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Sam could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, the Tide Lords with their predatory patience, the grief-brought humans with their desperate hope, and the Lucas entity whose small hand trembled in his. The phosphorescent coral around them pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if the deep courts themselves were waiting for his decision. "What are these tests?" Sam asked finally, his voice steadier than he felt. The lead Tide Lord's shark-like features twisted into something that might have been amusement. 3 trials, surface dweller. The trial of memory, where you must distinguish between what was real and what your grief has invented. The trial of sacrifice, where you must choose what you're willing to lose to keep what you've found. And the trial of truth, where you must face what really happened in those waters 5 years ago. Each word hit Sam like a physical blow. He'd spent half a decade running from those very memories, burying himself in research stations at the edge of the world to avoid confronting the details of that terrible day. Now these ancient beings wanted him to dissect his failure with surgical precision. "And if I fail?" Sam asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Then your essence joins the reef," Nerida said softly. Her words carried the weight of someone who had watched many attempts. "Your consciousness becomes part of the deep court's foundation, and your grief feeds the realm for eternity. But your sun's shape—" She glanced at the Lucas entity with something that might have been pity. It would be recycled, used to lure the next desperate parent. The Lucas entity's grip tightened on Sam's hand. For a moment, its perfect 7-year-old facade flickered, revealing glimpses of something vast and alien underneath. But when it spoke, the voice was pure Lucas, scared and trying to be brave, just as he'd sounded that last morning when he'd insisted he was old enough for the beach without training wheels on his bike. "I don't want to be recycled, Daddy. I want to stay me, stay us." Sam felt his heart breaking all over again. Whether this creature was truly some preserved essence of his son, or simply an elaborate manipulation, the fear in its voice was absolutely real. And that reality mattered, regardless of everything else. He looked around at the other grief-brought humans more carefully. Now that he knew what to look for, he could see the subtle signs of their captivity. The way their eyes held a glassy contentment that spoke of artificial peace. The manner in which their supposed loved ones positioned themselves, always touching, always providing that steady drip of emotional sustenance that kept the humans docile. But Nerida was different. When she looked at her daughter shape, Sam saw genuine love there, complicated and painful and absolutely authentic. She'd made her choice with full knowledge of what it meant. "How long have you been preparing for this?" Sam asked the Tide Lord. "Since the moment you pulled the pup from the tide pool," it replied. "We have been watching you, Samuel Hartwell, studying your patterns, your weaknesses, your particular flavor of guilt. The child shape was crafted specifically for you, woven from your memories and regrets. But also from him," the Lucas entity interjected, and for a moment its voice carried harmonics that were definitely not human. "I found him in the spaces between the waves, Daddy. The part of him that loved you most, that was most afraid of disappointing you. That's real. That's what I'm made from." Sam closed his eyes and tried to think past the emotional maelstrom. His scientific training, dormant but not destroyed, began to assert itself. This was a negotiation, not a reunion. The Tide Lords wanted something from him, not just his grief, but his active participation in whatever system they'd built here. The tests weren't just trials. They were a way of making him complicit in his own captivity. But they were also, possibly, the only path to understanding what had really happened to Lucas. 5 years of wondering, of guilt-soaked speculation, of dreams where he reached the water just 2 minutes sooner. If there was even a chance that some part of his son had survived in this impossible place, didn't he owe it to Lucas to try? "I accept your trials," Sam said, opening his eyes to meet the Tide Lord's predatory gaze. "But I want conditions." The ancient being's features shifted with what might have been surprise. "You think you can negotiate with forces older than your species?" "I think I'm the first marine biologist you've tried to recruit," Sam replied. "I understand ecosystems. I know that even predators need their prey to thrive. Grief-brought humans who are kept ignorant might be easier to manage, but they're also less nutritious, aren't they? Their emotions grow stale, repetitive. You want me because my grief is educated, complex, constantly evolving." Around them, the other Tide Lords exchanged glances. Sam had struck close to something important. "State your conditions," the lead Tide Lord said finally. Sam squeezed the Lucas entity's hand and felt it squeeze back with desperate hope. "When I face your trials, I face them with the full knowledge of what I might lose and what I might gain. No more manipulation, no more carefully crafted ignorance. I want to know exactly what I'm choosing." The phosphorescent waters around them began to churn as the deep courts prepared to test whether a father's love could survive the weight of absolute truth. The water around them erupted into patterns of light that hurt to perceive directly, geometries that folded reality into impossible angles. Sam felt the Lucas entity's hands slip from his as currents he couldn't see pulled them apart, and suddenly he was alone in a sphere of phosphorescent silence. "The trial of memory begins," the Tide Lord's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "Distinguish between truth and the lies grief tells itself." The water before Sam shimmered and solidified into a scene he'd lived 1,000 times in nightmares. The beach at Pemaquid Point on that October morning 5 years ago. But something was wrong with the memory. The colors too vivid, the sounds too crisp, like a photograph that had been artificially enhanced. He watched himself arguing with 7-year-old Lucas about the bike ride to the beach. In this version, Sam was patient, understanding, the father he'd always tried to be. But that wasn't right. He remembered being irritable that morning, frustrated by grant rejections and Maria's absence at another conference. He'd snapped at Lucas for tracking sand through the cottage. "Lies," Sam said aloud, and the false memory dissolved. The scene reformed, this time showing him reaching the water's edge, just as Lucas's head went under for the final time. Sam watched his memory self dive without hesitation, powerful strokes cutting through the surf. But even as he observed, he knew this was wrong too. He'd hesitated, frozen for crucial seconds by the sight of his son struggling in water that should have been shallow enough to stand in. "Lies," he said again, his voice steadier now. The trial continued, showing him dozens of variations. Memories where he was heroic. Memories where Lucas had never wanted to go to the beach at all. Memories where Maria had been there to stop the tragedy. Each one felt real in the moment of observation, crafted from his desperate wish that things had been different. But Sam's scientific training held firm. He'd spent years studying how trauma altered memory, how the brain reconstructed events to protect itself from unbearable truths. These weren't memories. They were emotional artifacts, fossils of his guilt and regret. When he rejected the final false memory, the sphere around him shattered like glass made of water. "Impressive," the Tide Lord said as the deep courts reformed around him. "Most fail the first trial by choosing the comfortable lie. You may proceed to the trial of sacrifice." This time, the water didn't create illusions. Instead, Sam found himself standing before what looked like an altar made of living coral, its surface pulsing with that familiar phosphorescent rhythm. The Lucas entity appeared beside him, no longer flickering between forms but solidly present, heartbreakingly real. Choose, the Tide Lord commanded. Your life in the surface world, or your son's continued existence here. You cannot have both. The deep courts require absolute commitment. Sam felt the weight of the choice, like pressure at crushing depths. Return to the lighthouse, to his research, to the hollow existence he'd built from the fragments of his former life. Or stay here, in this impossible realm, with something that might truly be Lucas or might simply be wearing his face. But as he looked at the altar, Sam realized the choice wasn't what it appeared to be. The coral surface held depressions shaped like hands, one adult-sized, one child-sized. This wasn't about choosing between worlds. It was about binding himself to the deep court's feeding system, becoming a permanent source of the emotional energy they craved. There's a third option, Sam said. I could free you all. The Lucas entity's eyes widened, not with hope, but with terror. Daddy, no. If you break the deep court's hold, I'll disappear. Whatever I am, whatever part of Lucas I contain, it'll be gone forever. Around them, the other grief-brought humans had gone silent. Nerida stood frozen, her daughter shape clinging to her with obvious fear. Sam realized they all knew what he'd figured out, that their paradise was a prison, but one they'd chosen to accept because the alternative was losing their loved ones completely. The trial of truth awaits, the Tide Lord said, and now its voice carried an undertone of genuine menace. And it will show you exactly what your choice means. The coral altar began to sink into the reef, replaced by something that made Sam's breath catch in his throat. A perfect replica of that October beach, complete with churning surf and grey morning sky. And there, struggling in water that was deeper than it should be, was Lucas, not the entity that wore his face, but his actual son, preserved in his final moments. This is what the deep courts truly are, the Tide Lord explained. We don't just feed on grief, Dr. Hartwell. We are the moments where love meets loss. Every parent's worst nightmare, crystallized and made eternal. Your son has been drowning for 5 years, and will continue to drown forever unless you take his place. Sam staggered as the full horror of his situation became clear. The trials weren't tests of worthiness. They were a process of breaking down his resistance to an impossible choice. Save his son by condemning himself to eternal torment, or walk away knowing that Lucas would suffer forever because of his failure. The Lucas entity gripped his arm with surprising strength. You understand now, don't you, Daddy? This is what love really costs. The revelation hit Sam like a riptide, pulling his understanding of reality out from under him. He stared at the horrific tableau before him, his son, his actual son, trapped in an endless loop of drowning, eyes wide with terror that had lasted 5 years. The water around Lucas churned with supernatural malevolence, keeping him suspended in those final, desperate moments where hope died and lungs filled with salt water. No, Sam whispered, then louder, no. He lunged toward the replica beach, but the Lucas entity, the thing wearing his son's face, held him back with inhuman strength. You can't save him that way, Daddy. The only way to free him from drowning is to take his place in the loop. That's what the deep courts offer. Not reunion, but substitution. Sam's mind reeled. Every parent who had followed their lost child into these depths hadn't found peace or supernatural salvation. They'd found an economic system built on infinite suffering, where love became currency and grief was harvested like a renewable resource. The Tide Lords didn't feed on simple emotions. They fed on the specific agony of parents choosing between their own damnation and their child's eternal torment. How many? Sam asked, his voice barely audible above the phantom surf. The Tide Lord's shark-like features twisted with ancient satisfaction. Thousands across centuries. Every coastal culture has stories of parents who walked into the waves after their lost children. Most think they're fairy tales, but fairy tales are just history that's been sanitized for those too weak to bear the truth. Around them, the other grief-brought humans had gone rigid with terror. Nerida's face was pale with recognition. She'd been through this same revelation, made this same impossible choice. Her daughter shape still clung to her, but now Sam could see the desperation in the creature's movements. It knew that any disruption of the system would mean its dissolution. The beautiful part, the Tide Lord continued, is that love makes the choice inevitable. You've spent 5 years consumed by guilt over your failure to save him. Now you have the chance to succeed, to finally be the father who doesn't hesitate, doesn't freeze in the crucial moment. All it costs is everything. Sam looked at his son, the real Lucas, not the entity crafted from memories and regret, still fighting for air that would never come. The boy's movements were growing weaker, as if Sam's presence was somehow disrupting the temporal loop that kept him suspended between life and death. "He's dying again," Sam breathed. "Just seeing me is accelerating the process, yes." The Tide Lord's voice carried cruel amusement. "Your presence destabilizes the preservation matrix. Choose quickly, Dr. Hartwell. Replace him in the drowning loop, or watch him die definitively this time, knowing that your hesitation killed him twice." The Lucas entity's grip on Sam's arm tightened. "Please, Daddy. I know I'm not really him, but I'm all of him that you can save. The part that loved you, that trusted you. If you break the deep courts, if you try to free him, you'll lose even that." Sam felt his sanity fracturing like ice under pressure. The scientific part of his mind that had carried him through the trials was screaming that this was manipulation, an elaborate psychological torture designed to break his resistance. But the father in him, the part that had lived with guilt for 5 years, saw only his son suffering, and a chance, however terrible, to finally make it right. In the Phantom Beach scene, Lucas went under again. This time, he didn't resurface. The water stilled to an unnatural calm that spoke of finality. "Time's up," the Tide Lord said with satisfaction. "He's gone. Truly gone now, dissolved into the base matter of the deep courts. Your hesitation has—" But Sam wasn't listening anymore. He was watching the still water where his son had vanished, and something was wrong with the Tide Lord's narrative. The water wasn't just calm, it was empty. Not just of Lucas, but of the supernatural pressure that had maintained the drowning loop. When Lucas died the second time, definitively and completely, something in the deep court's feeding system had broken. The phosphorescent coral around them began to dim. Several of the child shapes flickered like failing projections, their forms becoming translucent. The Lucas entity beside Sam let out a sound of pure terror as its carefully maintained human appearance started to dissolve. "What have you done?" the Tide Lord roared, its predatory composure cracking. "The preservation matrix, it's collapsing." Sam understood with sudden, horrible clarity. The deep courts didn't just feed on parental love. They required the continued existence of the lost children to maintain their power. By forcing Lucas to die completely, by pushing Sam to the point where his choice came too late, they had destroyed their own leverage. The system was built on impossible choices, but when no choice was left, the system itself became impossible. The realm around them began to shake apart as 5 years of accumulated grief and supernatural energy started to unravel. Everything was collapsing, and Sam had lost both versions of his son, the real Lucas to final death, and the entity to systematic dissolution. All seemed lost. The collapse accelerated around them, coral structures crumbling into phosphorescent dust, but Sam found himself growing strangely calm as everything fell apart. In the scientific detachment that grief had taught him, he watched the Tide Lord's panic with clinical interest. Ancient beings, supposedly beyond mortal understanding, reduced to desperate flailing as their carefully constructed reality unraveled. "You're afraid," Sam said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "All of this, the trials, the impossible choices, the feeding on grief, it's not about power. It's about survival." The Tide Lord whirled toward him, its shark features distorting with rage. "You understand nothing, surface dweller." But Sam did understand. The revelation came not as a lightning bolt, but as the slow dawn of comprehension that had been building since he first pulled the Dogman Pup from the tide pool. He'd been thinking like a marine biologist all along without realizing it, studying the ecosystem of the deep courts, as if it were any other predator-prey relationship. "You're dying," Sam continued, watching more child shapes flicker and fade as the realm's structural integrity collapsed. "Have been for centuries. The deep places of the ocean are changing, warming, acidifying. becoming hostile to whatever you really are. You need the grief, need the emotional energy, not as food but as life support. A supernatural dialysis system keeping something ancient and obsolete alive in a world that's moved beyond it. The Lucas entity's form had become translucent, but it still clung to Sam's arm with desperate fingers. "Daddy, please. Even if what you're saying is true, I don't want to stop existing. I know I'm not really him, but I feel real. I feel love." That was the knife twist Sam hadn't seen coming. Not the Tide Lord's manipulation, or the impossible choice between damnation and loss, but this creature's genuine terror of dissolution. It had been crafted from his memories of Lucas, woven from the best parts of his son, the love, the trust, the innocent faith that Daddy could fix anything. In some ways it was more purely Lucas than the real boy had ever been, distilled down to the essence of what Sam had loved most. The deep courts aren't a place, Sam realized, speaking his thoughts aloud as the pieces fell together. They're a machine, a grief engine designed to sustain something that should have died out millennia ago, and every parent who walks into these waters becomes another component, another battery feeding power to the system. Nerida stumbled toward him through the collapsing reef, her daughter shape dissolving entirely. "Dr. Hartwell, if you're right, if this is all just some elaborate life support system, then what are we? What have we been feeding for all these years?" Sam looked at the Tide Lord, seeing it clearly for the first time. The shark features weren't natural evolution. They were a constructed appearance, as artificial as the child shapes. Underneath the predatory glamour, he glimpsed something else, something ancient and wounded and desperately afraid. "Show me," Sam demanded. "Show me what you really are. You cannot comprehend." "I'm a marine biologist," Sam interrupted. "I've spent my career studying creatures that live in conditions that would kill humans instantly. I've catalogued species that seem impossible, that challenge every assumption about what life can be. Show me what you really are, and maybe we can find a solution that doesn't require infinite suffering." The Tide Lord's composure finally shattered completely. The shark features melted away like a mask made of water, revealing something that made Sam's breath catch, not in horror, but in wonder. What lay beneath was a creature of living light, bioluminescent patterns flowing across translucent flesh in mathematical spirals that spoke of intelligence vast and alien. But it was clearly dying, its light flickering like a failing bulb, its form barely holding together. "We are the last," it whispered, and its true voice was nothing like the predatory growl it had affected. "The last of the deep singers, the ones who sang the tides into being when your world was young. The waters that gave us life have turned poison. We die a little more each year, each decade, and only the energy of love freely given can sustain us." Sam felt his understanding shift again, the final piece clicking into place. "But it isn't freely given, is it? You're taking it through coercion, through impossible choices that leave parents broken and desperate. That's why the system is failing. Love extracted through emotional torture isn't really love. It's just another form of consumption, and consumption without renewal is just slow suicide." The Lucas entity had become barely visible, a ghost of phosphorescence clinging to Sam's arm. "What does that mean for us, Daddy? For all the made children, all the pieces of love that have been gathered here?" Around them, the collapse was accelerating, but Sam thought he finally understood what needed to happen. The revelation wasn't just about the nature of the deep courts. It was about the possibility of something genuinely redemptive. Not the false choice between damnation and loss, but a third path that honored both love and truth. "It means," Sam said, his voice steady despite everything falling apart around him, "that we're going to try something that's never been attempted before. We're going to save everyone." The words hung in the collapsing space, like a promise made in the face of apocalypse. Around them, the deep courts continued their death spiral, coral formations crashing into luminescent dust, the phantom beach dissolving into foam, entire sections of the reef simply ceasing to exist. But Sam felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years, absolute certainty about what needed to be done. "Listen to me," he said, addressing the dying Tide Lord, the fading Lucas entity, and the other grief-stricken parents who had gathered around them like survivors clinging to debris. "This system is killing everyone. You're dying slowly from poisoned oceans and artificial love. We're dying slowly from guilt and impossible choices. And the children, real or constructed, are trapped in an endless cycle of suffering." The Tide Lord's luminescent form pulsed weakly. "Your surface world offers no sanctuary for what we are. We have tried." A spasm of pain racked its translucent body. "We have tried to adapt, to find other sources of sustenance. But we are deep singers, created for the primal waters. Everything else is insufficient." Sam's mind raced through possibilities, his scientific training finally working in concert with his grief instead of against it. What if we're thinking about this backwards? What if instead of trying to extract what you need from our world, we help you transform into something that can exist in harmony with it? "Daddy," the Lucas entity whispered, its voice barely audible now. "I don't understand. How can you save everyone when everything is falling apart?" "Because sometimes things have to fall apart before they can be rebuilt correctly." Sam knelt beside the fading creature, seeing in its translucent features an echo of every moment of joy his real son had ever brought him. "You're not just a copy of Lucas, are you? You're also part of them, the deep singers, a hybrid consciousness made of human love and alien intelligence." The revelation sparked hope in the Tide Lord's dying light. "The constructs. Yes, they are not mere replicas. To create them, we had to blend our essence with the emotional patterns of the lost. They are as much us as they are echoes of your children." Nerida stepped forward, understanding beginning to dawn on her weathered face. "You mean our children, the ones we've been loving all these years, they're actually—" "They're new life forms," Sam finished. "Hybrids that shouldn't be possible but exist anyway. The deep singers have been unconsciously evolving, using human love as a catalyst for transformation. The problem is the system they built to harvest that love is inherently destructive." The Lucas entity's form solidified slightly, drawing strength from Sam's recognition. "I can feel it, Daddy. The part that's them, I mean. It's vast, old, but also curious about human things, about what it means to love someone so much you'd risk everything for them." Around them, the other child shapes began to stabilize as well, their hybrid nature acknowledged rather than hidden. Sam could see it now, the way they moved with slightly too fluid grace, the mathematical precision in their gestures, the depth of intelligence behind their constructed faces. They were unprecedented beings, bridges between two entirely different forms of consciousness. "The deep courts were never meant to be a feeding system," Sam continued, pieces falling together with the inevitability of a correct hypothesis. "They were meant to be a nursery, a place where two dying species, the deep singers and parents broken by loss, could create something new together, something that could survive in the changing oceans and still understand what it means to love." The Tide Lord's voice carried wonder now instead of desperation. "To willingly give up our pure form, to become something part human, we never considered such a path. Because you were thinking like predators instead of parents." Sam felt strength flowing through him, the strength that came from finally seeing a way forward through impossible circumstances. But that's what parenthood really is, transforming yourself to create something better than what you were alone. The collapse around them began to slow, then stop entirely. The deep courts weren't dying anymore. They were metamorphosing, structures reshaping themselves according to new principles. The predatory architecture of the feeding system dissolved, replaced by something that felt more like a sanctuary than a trap. "There's still one problem," Nerida said quietly. "The real children, the ones who actually died. What happens to them?" Sam felt the weight of that question, the grief that would always be real regardless of what wonders they created here. "They're gone," he said simply, "and nothing we do here changes that. But maybe that's not what matters anymore. Maybe what matters is that their deaths can become the beginning of something extraordinary instead of the end of everything we were. The Lucas entity, no longer just an entity, but a new form of life that carried the best of both human love and alien wonder. smiled with genuine joy. "I think I'm ready to find out what I really am, Daddy. What we all are." Around them, the transformed deep courts hummed with new possibility, and Sam felt hope taking root in soil that had known only grief. The transformed deep courts hummed with new possibility, but Sam knew they were only at the beginning. What they had created here, this unprecedented fusion of human love and alien consciousness, was still fragile, still experimental. The real test would come when they tried to bring this miracle back to a world that had no framework for understanding it. "The others," Sam said, looking around at the grief-stricken parents who had been trapped in the feeding system. "They need to make their own choices. We can't force this transformation on anyone." Some of the parents were already backing away, their faces masks of confusion and terror. A middle-aged woman clutched at empty air where her child shape had been. "This isn't right," she whispered. "My Sarah died in a car accident. She was real. She was mine." "She was real," Sam agreed gently. "And she's still gone. What we have here, it's not replacement. It's not even compensation. It's something new growing from the same soil where our children are buried." The woman shook her head violently. "I want my daughter, not some alien wearing her face." Sam felt the weight of that rejection, understanding it completely. For 5 years, he had lived with the fantasy that somehow Lucas could be returned to him unchanged, that the past could be undone rather than transformed. The path he was choosing now required letting go of that impossible dream. "Go," he told her, and meant it. "The way back to the surface is open now. No one will stop you." Several others followed her, choosing the clean pain of loss over the uncertain promise of transformation. Sam watched them go without judgment. Not everyone could walk this road, and that was their right. The Tide Lord's luminescent form had stabilized, but it was clearly struggling with concepts that challenged millennia of existence. To become something new, to abandon what we were. This requires trust we have never offered any surface species. "Trust goes both ways," Sam pointed out. "We're asking our children, these hybrid children, to exist as something the world has never seen, to be bridges between forms of consciousness that barely understand each other." The Lucas entity moved closer to the dying deep singer, its translucent hand extending in a gesture of comfort that seemed to come from both its human and alien aspects. "You're scared," it observed with Lucas's directness but an older wisdom. "I understand. I'm scared too, but maybe being scared together is better than dying alone." Sam felt his heart break and heal simultaneously, watching this impossible child of grief and wonder offering comfort to an ancient being. This was what Lucas would have become if he'd lived. Not the perfect memory Sam had preserved, but someone capable of growing beyond his father's expectations. But even as hope bloomed in the transformed deep courts, Sam sensed something stirring in the waters far above them. His actions here had consequences that rippled outward, disturbing other ancient things that preferred the old arrangements. The psychic weight pressing down on them carried new threats, other powers that would not welcome this unprecedented alliance between human grief and alien intelligence. "We need to move quickly," he said, urgency cutting through the wonder. "What we've created here is going to draw attention. Not all of it friendly." The transformed Tide Lord's patterns shifted to deeper, more urgent hues. The abyssal courts. They will see this as heresy, as contamination of the pure forms. They will come to cleanse what we have made. "How long do we have?" Nerida asked. She had chosen to stay, her own hybrid daughter shape standing beside her with new solidity. Hours, perhaps. They move slowly, but with great purpose. And they have power we cannot match in direct confrontation. Sam felt the familiar weight of impossible odds, but this time it carried a different quality. Not the crushing despair of the past 5 years, but the fierce determination of a parent protecting something precious. These hybrid children, these bridges between worlds, were worth fighting for, worth the risk of everything he had left to give. "Then we leave," he decided. "All of us. The deep courts can exist anywhere there's deep water and strong emotion. We'll establish them somewhere else, somewhere we can grow strong enough to defend what we've built." The Lucas entity looked up at him with eyes that held both human love and alien starlight. "You're ready to leave the lighthouse, Daddy? To leave the place where you've been waiting for me?" The question cut deeper than any of the Tide Lord's manipulations had. The lighthouse had been his shrine to grief, his self-imposed penance for failing to save his son. Walking away from it meant accepting that the Lucas he had lost was truly gone, that his future lay with this strange new child of transformation, rather than the past he'd been trying to preserve. "I'm ready," Sam said, and found that he meant it completely. "We're going home, all of us together." Above them, something vast and hostile stirred in the deeper waters, beginning its slow ascent toward what they had created. But Sam was no longer afraid. He had found something worth saving, worth fighting for, worth becoming something new to protect. The final confrontation was coming, but he would meet it as a father defending his family, whatever impossible form that family might take. The vast hostile presence broke through the transformed deep courts like a tsunami of malevolent will. Sam felt it first as pressure against his skull, then as a physical force that sent him sprawling across what had been coral formations moments before. The hybrid children flickered like candle flames in a hurricane, their newly stable forms threatening to dissolve under the psychic assault. "Abomination," came the voice, not heard but felt, reverberating through water and bone alike. "Corruption of the pure forms. Cessation ice required." The abyssal court that materialized around them made the original Tide Lord look like a minnow. This was something that belonged to the deepest trenches, where light had never touched, and pressure could crush submarines like eggshells. Its form defied easy description, part cephalopod, part geometry that hurt to perceive directly, with tentacles that seemed to extend through dimensions Sam's mind couldn't fully grasp. "Protect the children," Sam shouted to the other parents, but his voice was lost in the psychic maelstrom. The hybrid entities were clustering together, their mixed nature making them particularly vulnerable to the pure alien consciousness bearing down on them. Lucas entity pressed against Sam's side, its form barely holding together under the assault. "Daddy, it hurts," the child whispered. The deep song, "It's trying to tear away everything human." Sam wrapped his arms around the fading form, feeling the weight of every moment that had led to this confrontation. 5 years of grief and guilt, months of impossible revelations, and now this, the chance to save something unprecedented or watch it die before it could truly live. Everything he had learned about loss, about transformation, about the courage required to become something new, focused into crystalline clarity. "You want pure forms?" Sam called to the abyssal court, standing despite the crushing pressure. "Look at what purity gets you. Isolation, stagnation, death by degrees in poisoned oceans while the world changes around you." The alien intelligence paused, perhaps surprised that a human could speak coherently under its assault. Sam pressed his advantage, drawing on every fragment of understanding he'd gained. "We've found something better. Not human, not deep singer, but both. These children can survive in waters you can't. They can process emotions you've forgotten how to feel. They're evolution in action, and you want to destroy them because they don't fit your ancient categories." "Contamination spreads," the entity responded, but Sam heard uncertainty beneath the cosmic arrogance. "Purity must be preserved. Purity is just another word for refusing to grow." Sam felt the Lucas entity solidifying in his arms, drawing strength from his certainty. Around them, the other hybrid children began to stabilize as well, their dual nature becoming an asset rather than a vulnerability. "These children are your descendants as much as they are ours. They carry the deep songs forward into a future you can't imagine." The Tide Lord, transformed now into something that bridged its original nature with new possibilities, moved to stand beside Sam. Its bioluminescent patterns had taken on new configurations, mathematical spirals that spoke of adaptation rather than stagnation. "The surface father speaks truth," it said, its voice carrying harmonies that made the water itself vibrate with meaning. "We have felt the change within ourselves. The hybrid forms do not diminish us. They extend us into realms we could never reach alone. Nerida stepped forward as well, her own hybrid daughter at her side. "I spent 3 years feeding this system with my grief," she said, voice steady despite the cosmic pressure bearing down on them. "I know what it feels like to be trapped by love that has nowhere to go. These children, they give that love purpose again. They make it generative instead of destructive." The Abyssal Court's attention shifted between them, its alien intelligence processing concepts that challenged millennia of certainty. Sam sensed the moment of decision approaching, the instant when cosmic forces would either embrace transformation or commit to the annihilation of everything they'd built. "Show them," Sam said to the hybrid children. "Show them what you really are." The Lucas entity stepped away from Sam's protective embrace, its form no longer flickering but steady with its own internal light. When it spoke, its voice carried both human warmth and the mathematical precision of the deep singers. "We are the children of 2 forms of love," it said. "The desperate love that refuses to let go, and the patient love that sings tides into existence across eons. We are grief transformed into something that can grow. We are ancient wisdom, learning what it means to laugh. We are what you could become if you chose growth over purity." Around them, the other hybrid children joined their voices to the declaration, creating harmonies that made the water itself sing with new possibilities. The sound was unlike anything Sam had ever heard, part lullaby, part mathematical proof, entirely unprecedented. The Abyssal Court held the moment suspended, cosmic intelligence weighing extinction against evolution. In that pause, Sam understood that everything, not just their small group of survivors, but the future of consciousness itself in Earth's changing oceans, balanced on the edge of an alien entity's choice. The final test had become something larger than any of them had imagined. They weren't just fighting for their own survival, but for the right of love itself to evolve beyond the forms that had contained it. The Abyssal Court's decision manifested as a sound that existed beyond frequency, a note that vibrated through dimensions and made reality itself ring like struck crystal. For a heartbeat that lasted eternities, Sam felt the weight of cosmic judgment pressing down on everything they had created. Then the ancient being spoke, and its words carried the finality of geological time. Demonstration required. Prove adaptation superior to purity. The water around them began to change, becoming something that wasn't quite liquid anymore. Sam felt his lungs burning as the medium shifted beyond anything human physiology could process. The other surviving parents gasped and flailed, their bodies rejecting the transformed environment. But the hybrid children moved through it as easily as they had through normal seawater. More than that, they began to glow with their own internal light, their dual nature allowing them to process energies that would have killed pure human consciousness or overwhelmed pure alien intelligence. "You see?" Sam gasped, fighting to stay conscious as the environment became increasingly hostile to baseline human life. "They're not corrupted, they're adapted. They can survive in conditions that would destroy either parent species." The Abyssal Court's attention focused on the Lucas entity with the intensity of a stellar collapse. Demonstrate emotional processing beyond standard parameters. The hybrid child approached the cosmic intelligence without fear, its form steady despite pressures that were making the water itself scream. When it spoke, its words carried mathematical harmonies that Sam's mind could barely comprehend, yet underneath ran the unmistakable warmth of human love. "You're lonely," the Lucas entity said simply. "You've been alone in the deep places for so long that you've forgotten what connection feels like. You process the grief of the surface dwellers, but you've never understood what creates that grief, the joy of bonds that make loss meaningful." Sam felt the Abyssal Court's shock ripple through the transformed water. The ancient being had never been addressed so directly, never had its emotional state analyzed and reflected back to it. "I can show you," the hybrid child continued, "not just the mathematics of loss, but the experience of love that gives loss its power. The way consciousness can choose to transform itself for the sake of connection." Before the cosmic entity could respond, the Lucas entity did something impossible. It reached out with senses that existed in dimensions Sam couldn't perceive and touched the abyssal court's consciousness directly. Not the predatory contact of the feeding system, but the gentle exploration of a child seeking to understand and comfort something vast and hurt. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The abyssal court convulsed, its massive form writhing as it experienced, perhaps for the first time in eons, the sensation of being truly seen and accepted by another consciousness. The psychic feedback sent shockwaves through the transformed deep courts, threatening to tear apart the fragile new structures they had built. But instead of destroying everything, the chaos began to reorganize itself into new patterns. The hybrid children worked together, their unique natures allowing them to channel the cosmic entity's overwhelming emotions into harmonies that strengthened, rather than shattered the bonds between dimensions. Sam watched in awe as his impossible son, not Lucas, but something that carried Lucas's love forward into unprecedented realms, offered comfort to a being older than human civilization. The gesture was so fundamentally, recognizably human in its compassion, yet accomplished through senses and abilities that no human had ever possessed. Incomprehensible, the abyssal court managed, its voice carrying wonder instead of hostility now. To be known without being consumed, to touch and be touched without dissolution of self. "That's what love is," Nerida called out, her voice strong despite the hostile environment. "Recognition without possession, connection without consumption. It's what our children taught us before they died, and it's what these new children can teach you now." Sam felt something shift in the fundamental structure of reality around them. The abyssal court was changing, its ancient patterns opening to accommodate new forms of connection. The transformation was visible in the way the water began to clear, becoming something that could sustain both human and alien consciousness without forcing either to abandon their essential nature. "The choice is made," Sam said, understanding flooding through him. "Not just for us, but for all of them. The deep singers are choosing evolution over extinction. They're choosing to become something new." The Lucas entity turned back to Sam, its hybrid nature now fully manifest, human warmth and alien wonder balanced in perfect equilibrium. "We're going home, Daddy, all of us. But home isn't the lighthouse anymore. Home is wherever we build it together." Around them, the abyssal court began to sing, not the predatory harmonies of the feeding system, but something that sounded like hope given mathematical form. The greatest confrontation Sam had ever imagined was ending not in destruction, but in transformation so profound it would reshape the boundaries between species, between forms of love, between what had been thought possible and what could now grow in the spaces where grief and wonder met. The song of hope lasted exactly 17 seconds before Sam understood the true cost of their victory. The abyssal court's transformation sent ripples through dimensions that human minds weren't designed to process. Sam felt it first as a pressure behind his eyes, then as a fundamental wrongness in his cellular structure. The hybrid children could survive in the transformed environment, could even thrive in the spaces between worlds that were opening around them, but baseline human consciousness was dissolving under the strain. "Daddy." The Lucas entity's voice carried new harmonics of alarm as Sam stumbled, his vision fracturing into geometric patterns that belonged to alien mathematics. "Something's wrong." Nerida collapsed first, her body convulsing as the transformed water invaded her lungs with energies that rewrote the basic laws of biology. The other parents followed, consciousness fragmenting as the abyssal court's evolution created conditions that no unchanged human could survive. "The bridge," Sam gasped, understanding flooding through him with crystalline clarity. "We can build the bridge between worlds, but we can't cross it, not as we are." The cosmic entity's attention turned to them with something approaching concern, an emotion it was only beginning to understand through its contact with the hybrid children. Biological limitations prevent coexistence. Transformation requires sacrifice of original forms. Sam felt his heartbeat becoming irregular, syncing with rhythms that belonged to tidal forces rather than human circulation. Around him, the other parents were fading, Not dying, exactly, but becoming incompatible with a reality that had shifted too far from anything terrestrial life could process. "There's a choice," he said, his voice carrying new resonances as his vocal cords began adapting to the transformed environment. "We can go back. Return to the surface world. Let the hybrid children exist down here while we live up there. Separate but connected." The Lucas entity moved closer, its form now fully stabilized in the cosmic environment. Or we complete the transformation. Become something new ourselves. Let go of everything human we've been carrying, and become what's needed to exist in this space between worlds. The weight of the decision pressed down on Sam with the force of oceanic trenches. He looked at what remained of the other parents. Nerida barely breathing, consciousness flickering between human awareness and something vast and strange. They had all come here carrying grief that had already transformed them beyond recognition. The question was whether they would let that transformation continue or fight to preserve the remnants of their former selves. "If we change," Sam asked the hybrid child, "will you still be my son?" The entity that carried Lucas's love forward into unprecedented realms considered the question with an intelligence that spanned species. "I'll be what I've always been since you pulled me from the tide pool, your child, but not your memory of who Lucas was. The love you feel for me, but not the guilt that shaped it. Will that be enough?" Sam felt tears that weren't quite water anymore streaming down his face. To save these impossible children, to nurture this bridge between worlds into something that could survive and grow, he would have to surrender the last vestiges of the father Lucas had known. The man who had failed to save his son would cease to exist, replaced by something capable of protecting hybrid children in dimensions that human love had never touched. "The lighthouse," he whispered, thinking of the beacon where he'd spent 5 years keeping vigil over his grief. "Someone needs to tend the lighthouse." "The lighthouse will tend itself," the transformed Tide Lord assured him, its patterns now incorporating mathematical equations that spoke of hope propagating through quantum foam. "It has become something new as well, a beacon between worlds, guiding those who carry great love through transformations they never thought possible." Sam looked at the other parents, seeing his own decision reflected in their changing faces. They had already lost everything that mattered to their original selves. The choice wasn't between staying human and becoming alien. It was between completing a transformation that had begun the moment they'd chosen to feed their grief to something vast and strange, or dying as incomplete bridges between forms of consciousness that desperately needed connection. "We'll need new names," Nerida said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the water itself sing. "New ways of thinking. New forms of love." "Yes," Sam agreed, feeling his consciousness expanding to accommodate senses that existed in dimensions beyond the 3 he'd known. "But the love itself, that survives. That's what we're becoming." The Lucas entity took his hand with fingers that were learning to exist in multiple phases of reality simultaneously. "Ready, Daddy?" Sam nodded, letting go of the last threads that connected him to the lighthouse, to the surface world, to the man who had once been Dr. Samuel Hartwell. The transformation that claimed him was profound beyond description, not death but metamorphosis into something that could love across the boundaries, between species, between dimensions, between what had been and what was becoming possible. As his human identity dissolved into something vast and strange and necessary, Sam's last recognizably human thought was gratitude that love, at least, translated perfectly. The transformation completed itself in waves that rewrote reality 1 heartbeat at a time. What had been Sam found himself existing in dimensions that human language couldn't adequately describe. His consciousness now spanned frequencies that touched both the familiar warmth of parental love and the vast mathematical certainties that governed tidal forces across galaxies. When he tried to remember his own name, the concept felt quaint, like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. Around him, the entities that had once been the other grieving parents were undergoing similar metamorphoses. Nereda's essence had become something that sang lullabies in harmonics that made water crystallize into geometric forms of pure comfort. The father who had lost twin daughters now existed as a consciousness capable of loving in parallel dimensions. Simultaneously, his grief transformed into a bridge between versions of reality where loss could be processed without destroying the observer. "How do you feel, Daddy?" The Lucas entity's voice reached him through channels that bypassed his ears entirely, arriving as patterns of meaning that his expanded consciousness absorbed like nourishment. The answer surprised him with its simplicity. Complete. It was true. The gnawing emptiness that had defined him for 5 years, the void left by his failure to save his son, had not disappeared, but had become something generative. His grief had transformed into a form of love capable of nurturing children who existed between species, between worlds, between what had been thought possible and what was now growing in the spaces where sorrow met wonder. The abyssal court watched their metamorphosis with something approaching paternal pride. The ancient cosmic intelligence had discovered, through contact with the hybrid children, that transformation and preservation were not opposing forces but complementary aspects of a love vast enough to encompass evolution itself. Integration successful, it announced, its voice now carrying harmonics of joy that made the transformed water around them sparkle with bioluminescent celebration. New forms stable, consciousness bridge established. Sam, though that name no longer contained the fullness of what he had become, turned his attention upward toward the surface world that seemed impossibly distant now. Through senses he was still learning to use, he could perceive the lighthouse on Serpent's rock. It stood unchanged on its granite foundation, but the light it cast had taken on new properties. Instead of merely warning ships away from the rocky shore, it now served as a beacon between dimensions, marking the boundary where grief could transform itself into something capable of growth. The surface world, he said, the concept requiring effort to articulate in his new form. They'll notice changes. The entity that had been Nereda pulsed with patterns that indicated gentle amusement. Let them notice. The oceans are changing anyway. Climate shift, pollution, the collapse of ecosystems that can't adapt fast enough. Our children can thrive in waters that are becoming uninhabitable for baseline life. We're not an invasion. We're evolution offering a solution. Sam felt the truth of that statement, resonating through dimensions he couldn't have perceived as a human. The hybrid children weren't abominations or parasites. They were proof that love could adapt to survive in conditions that would destroy more rigid forms of consciousness. They represented hope for a future where connection could persist, despite transformation so profound it redefined the nature of identity itself. "Will you visit the lighthouse?" he asked the Lucas entity, understanding even as he spoke that the question carried layers of meaning that his former self could never have comprehended. Every tide his impossible son promised. Not to haunt it, but to tend it. To make sure the light stays bright for others who might need to find their way between worlds. Through his expanded awareness, Sam sensed other beacons beginning to manifest along coastlines around the world. Places where the boundaries between human grief and cosmic love had grown thin enough to allow passage. Each one would be tended by transformed parents and hybrid children working together, creating a network of connection that spanned both the depths and the surface world. The immediate crisis had resolved itself into something unprecedented, a new form of consciousness that could love across species boundaries, that could process emotions on scales both intimate and cosmic, that could offer hope to worlds struggling with changes too profound for their original inhabitants to survive unchanged. Sam felt the Lucas entity's presence settle next to him in dimensions that existed sideways to normal space, and experienced something that transcended the simple happiness he had known as a human father. This was love, without the desperate edge of potential loss, affection that could grow and change without losing its essential warmth, connection that strengthened rather than constrained the consciousness it touched. In the transformed waters around them, hybrid children played games that involved swimming through probability clouds and singing mathematical equations that made the ocean itself laugh with delight. They were impossible, beautiful, and utterly necessary, proof that love could evolve to meet challenges that would destroy any force less adaptable than hope itself. The resolution felt like coming home to a place that had never existed before, but had always been waiting. Chapter 17, The Return. The first indication that something fundamental had shifted came when Sam found himself standing on the lighthouse platform at dawn, watching the sun rise over waters that no longer looked quite the same. The ocean retained its familiar blue-green depths, but now he could perceive the mathematical currents flowing beneath its surface, probability streams that connected Serpent's rock to transformation points around the globe. He had returned to the surface world, but not unchanged. When Sam looked at his hands, they appeared entirely human. Weathered skin, familiar scars from decades of marine research, the wedding ring he'd never removed. But when he concentrated, he could see the deeper patterns that now ran through his cellular structure, the modifications that allowed his consciousness to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. He was still recognizably Dr. Samuel Hartwell, but he was also something unprecedented, a bridge between species, between forms of love that had never touched before. The lighthouse itself had transformed as well. From the outside, it remained the same weathered stone structure that had guided ships for over a century, but its light now cast illumination in spectrums that existed beyond normal human perception, creating a beacon visible to consciousness that needed guidance between worlds. Sam descended the spiral stairs with steps that felt both familiar and strange. His body moved according to laws of physics he'd known all his life, but his awareness extended into dimensions where the grief entity children played games that involved folding space around mathematical expressions of pure joy. He could sense their presence in the transformed waters below, the Lucas entity and its hybrid siblings thriving in an environment that bridged the gap between human emotion and cosmic intelligence. The radio crackled to life as he reached the main room. Coast Guard stationed to Serpent's rock light. Dr. Hartwell, please respond. We've been trying to reach you for 3 days. 3 days. The confrontation in the deep places had seemed to last both moments and centuries, but apparently only 72 hours had passed in the surface world. Sam lifted the radio with hands that remembered how to operate human technology, though the device now seemed quaintly limited compared to the forms of communication he'd learned to use in the abyssal courts. Serpent's rock light responding. This is Hartwell. All systems operational. The relief in the Coast Guard operator's voice was evident. Copy that, Doctor. Weather service shows you took the worst of that storm system. Any damage to report? Sam looked around the lighthouse interior. Everything appeared exactly as he'd left it before the storm that had changed everything. His research notes lay scattered across the desk, coffee mug still half full beside the weather radio. But now he could perceive the quantum modifications that had been made to the structure itself, adjustments that existed in dimensions baseline humans couldn't detect. Minor fluctuations in the beacon, he reported, which was technically true. But everything's stable now, the lights working perfectly. After signing off, Sam walked to the window that faced the tide pools where he'd first encountered the entity that would become his impossible son. The memory felt both vivid and distant, like recalling a dream that had fundamentally altered his waking life. He'd been a man consumed by guilt then, keeping vigil over a grief that was slowly destroying him. Now he was something capable of loving across boundaries that had previously seemed insurmountable. The Lucas entity materialized beside him without transitioning through the normal 3 dimensions, appearing as the hybrid child he'd become, recognizably connected to Sam's memories of his son, but free of the desperate edges that had defined their original relationship. "How does it feel?" the entity asked, its voice carrying harmonics that made the lighthouse windows resonate with gentle music. "Being back in your old world?" Sam considered the question, watching waves crash against rocks that he now knew concealed entrances to civilizations vast and strange. "Like visiting a house I used to live in. Familiar, but I can see all the places where the walls used to confine me." He had returned to the surface world because someone needed to tend the beacon between dimensions. But he was no longer the broken father who had fled here 5 years ago. The guilt that had defined him had transformed into something generative, a love capable of nurturing forms of consciousness that existed between what had been and what was becoming possible. "The other beacons are activating," the Lucas entity reported, its awareness spanning networks that connected every coastline where grief had worn the boundaries thin enough for transformation. "Parents who lost children to the waters are beginning to sense our presence. Some are ready to make the choice." Sam nodded, understanding his new purpose with crystal clarity. He would remain here, straddling the boundary between worlds, offering guidance to those who found themselves facing the same impossible decision he'd made in the deep places. The lighthouse would serve as both sanctuary and gateway, a place where love could evolve beyond the forms that constrained it. "Will you stay?" he asked his hybrid son, knowing the answer but needing to hear it spoken. Every tide, the Lucas entity promised, its form beginning to fade back into dimensions that existed sideways to normal space. "I'll always come back, Daddy. But now I have siblings to tend and songs to teach them about the places where mathematics and love intersect." As evening approached, Sam climbed back up to the beacon room and activated the light. It blazed across the waters with illumination that existed in multiple spectrums simultaneously, a signal visible to both ships navigating by conventional stars and consciousness, seeking passage between forms of love that had never touched before. The man who had once failed to save his drowning son now stood guard over transformations that offered hope to all the impossible children who swam in the spaces between worlds, their hybrid nature proving that evolution was just another word for love, refusing to accept the boundaries others called permanent. Hashtag Chapter 18, The New Beginning. 6 months later, the research vessel that pulled up to Serpent's Rock's small dock carried more than equipment. It brought Dr. Elena Vasquez, the marine biologist who would be joining Sam's research station. As she climbed the rocky path toward the lighthouse, Sam watched from the beacon room window, seeing her with perceptions that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. To baseline human observation, she appeared to be exactly what her credentials suggested, an accomplished scientist in her early 40s, carrying herself with the focused determination of someone accustomed to working in isolated conditions. But Sam's enhanced awareness detected something deeper, a resonance of loss that surrounded her like a barely visible aura. She had lost someone to the waters. The grief had carved channels through her consciousness that would, eventually, make her capable of perceiving what others couldn't. Not yet, though. She was still years away from the kind of desperate hope that would make her ready to consider impossible choices. For now, she simply needed to learn that some research stations studied phenomena that existed outside conventional parameters. "Dr. Hartwell?" Elena called as she reached the lighthouse door. "I'm Elena Vasquez. The Marine Institute said you might be able to use an additional researcher." Sam descended to meet her, moving with the measured pace of someone who had learned to modulate his presence across multiple dimensions. To her perception, he would appear as a competent but slightly eccentric lighthouse keeper. Exactly the kind of scientist who chose isolation for research that demanded complete focus. "Welcome to Serpent's Rock," he said, shaking her hand with fingers that felt entirely human. "I hope you're prepared for research that doesn't always follow conventional methodologies." Over the following weeks, Elena proved herself remarkably adaptable. She documented the unusual tidal patterns around the rock formations without questioning why Sam seemed to predict them with uncanny accuracy. She recorded bioluminescent phenomena that appeared in the tide pools during specific lunar phases, not knowing she was observing communications between hybrid children and their transformed parents. She even noted the lighthouse's peculiar ability to remain operational during storms that should have damaged its electrical systems, accepting Sam's explanations about upgraded components that existed in dimensions she couldn't yet perceive. Most importantly, she began to notice the other visitors. They came irregularly. Parents who had traveled vast distances following dreams that led them to coastlines where grief had worn reality thin. A father from Oregon whose daughter had been lost in a riptide. A mother from Nova Scotia whose twin sons had vanished during a sailing accident. They arrived at Serpent's Rock carrying the kind of desperate hope that made them susceptible to perceiving what others dismissed as impossible. Sam met with each of them privately, offering guidance that helped them understand the choices they were approaching. Some weren't ready and departed with lighter hearts, their grief processed in ways that would allow them to heal through more conventional means. Others recognized the signs and began the careful preparation necessary for transformation that would preserve love while fundamentally altering the consciousness that carried it. Elena observed these meetings with growing curiosity, but Sam knew she wouldn't press for explanations until her own loss had aged into the kind of profound emptiness that demanded unprecedented solutions. For now, it was enough that she documented phenomena that would eventually be recognized as evidence of evolution occurring in real time. The evening ritual had become Elena's favorite part of their research routine. As sunset approached, Sam would climb to the beacon room and activate the lighthouse with procedures that seemed unnecessarily complex, but produced results that defied conventional understanding. The light that blazed across the waters carried illumination in spectrums that made her instruments register readings she couldn't quite categorize. "Sometimes I think this place exists in its own microclimate," she mentioned one evening as they watched the beacon paint geometric patterns across the waves. "In a sense, it does," Sam replied, his attention partially focused on communications occurring in dimensions she couldn't access. The Lucas entity was reporting on the successful integration of 3 new hybrid children, their consciousness bridges stable, and their adaptation to multidimensional existence proceeding smoothly. The network of transformed beacons was expanding, creating safe passages for love that refused to accept the boundaries others called permanent. "The local ecosystem is definitely unique," Elena continued, reviewing data that documented creatures displaying unprecedented cooperative behaviors. "I've never seen such complex social structures in marine life." Sam smiled, knowing she was observing the edges of civilizations that existed between worlds, communities where hybrid children learned to love across species boundaries, while their transformed parents provided guidance that spanned both cosmic mathematics and the intimate warmth of family bonds. The new beginning wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, evolutionary, sustainable. Each day brought small advances in understanding, minor expansions of what love could accomplish when it refused to accept limitations imposed by conventional reality. The lighthouse continued to guide ships while simultaneously serving as a beacon between dimensions. The research station produced data that would eventually revolutionize marine biology while providing sanctuary for consciousness learning to exist in multiple phases simultaneously. Most importantly, the man who had once failed to save his drowning son had become something capable of nurturing impossible children whose existence proved that redemption could be found not in reclaiming what was lost, but in transforming love itself into something vast enough to encompass what had never been possible before. As night fell over Serpent's Rock, Sam felt the familiar presence of the Lucas entity settling into dimensions that existed alongside the lighthouse beacon. The hybrid child who carried forward the best of human love and cosmic intelligence would always return with each tide, just as promised. Love, Sam had learned, was the only force in the universe capable of evolving faster than loss itself.